In today's video, we're going to learn about how to construct histograms. In our last video, we learned how to make frequency distribution tables. Well, histogram is how we visually represent these frequency of classes that we found in our frequency distribution tables. There are two main ways to construct histograms. You can construct a histogram using your frequency table or using your relative frequency. Remember, relative frequency is where we found the percent, the decimal, the fraction. So let's look at this first one. We're going to construct a frequency histogram using this data from the lifespan of the battery, the lifetime of batteries. 80 different randomly selected batteries. So you start by drawing your X and Y axis. Then you need to come up with a title for your histogram. So let's see, I'm looking at battery lifetimes. So I'll title this battery lifetime frequency table for histogram. So on our x-axis, we're going to do our classes, which are measured in hours. On our y-axis, it's going to be our frequencies for a frequency histogram. So now I need to make the tick marks on my X and Y axis. It's very important that you make these equally spaced. I like to use a ruler so I can make sure I'm doing my classes equally spaced from each other. Now to label the X axis, what you're going to do is you're going to use the beginning of each class. So I'm going to do 64, the beginning of the next class is 75, so that's my next tick mark. 86. And I'm going to continue this process until I get to the last class. When I do the last class, I write the first interval at 119, and then I write the ending of that interval. So that class ends at 130. So my last tick mark would be at 130. And I accidentally drew an extra one, so let me erase this. Another method of labeling your x-axis on a histogram is to use your midpoint values for each interval. Okay, then I look at my frequencies. My frequencies range from 5 to 22, so I need to make some tick marks on my y-axis for my frequencies, and I need to make sure I go up to 22. So this is kind of like a choice. You have to decide what you count by. I think I'll count by 5s this time. So again, make sure it's very important you use a ruler that you have equally spaced tick marks on your y-axis and x-axis. Then we're going to label those. So I'm going to count by 5. So this first tick mark is going to represent 5, then 10, 15, 20, and 25. And then what you do is you construct bars at each of those classes. So I have a height of 10, so my bar goes up to 10. My class starts at 64 and it ends at 75. So I then draw the bar from 64 to 75 and shade it in. I repeat that for each class. So this one has a frequency of 15, so I draw it at a height of 15. The bar begins at 75 and ends at 86. Now notice, it's very important that you see there's no gaps in between our two histograms. They connect with each other. That's the difference between a bar graph and a histogram. So here our class starts at 82 and goes up to 97 and it has a height of 22. Height of 17. And we begin at 97 and end at 108. Next one has a height of 11. So just above the 10. And it begins at 108 and goes to 119. And the last class has a height of 5 and begins at 118 and ends at 130. Now notice it's kind of hard to see exactly where my beginning or ending is. So it's always a good habit to put the numbers of your frequency at the top of each of your bars. That way there's no confusion if you accidentally draw it the wrong height. Okay, our second type of histogram that we might have is going to be our relative frequency histogram. So this is where we're going to be graphing the relative frequency, not the frequency itself. So usually the first thing you got to do is you have to compute the relative frequency from your frequency table. And remember, how to compute relative frequency is first we need to know the total amount in our sample. So there are 80 batteries in the sample. And then for the first group, I take 10 divided by 80 times by 100 to get my percentage. When I do that, I end up with a percentage of 12.5. Now, it's really hard to plot something at 12 and a half. So unless you're really small spacings in between your intervals, you might want to round to the nearest percentage on your relative frequency. So that's what I'm going to do in this example. So I'm computing the relative frequencies for each class, rounding to the nearest percent. And then I'm going to check and see how close I am. This is a way to check my work. I'm going to add up all my relative frequency. And we know this should be 100. I get 101, but again, I was rounding to the nearest percent, so that's something called a rounding error, which is completely acceptable. Okay, to draw a relative frequency histogram, you start the same way. We need to draw our x-axis and our y-axis. Start by titling the graph. So this is the relative frequency lifespan of batteries. And then we're going to use our ruler to help us come up with our tick marks on our x and y axis. Remember that on my x-axis, I'm still doing my classes, which are measured in hours. And on my y-axis, I'm doing my relative frequency or percentage. So you can title this either relative frequency or percentage. It does not matter what you title, but you need one of those titles on your y-axis. I'm going to call this one just the percents. And I went ahead and used a ruler to make my tick marks. And notice I don't have to do the same spacing for the x-axis as I do for the y. Okay, so let's see. Let's count by threes on the x-axis. So 3, 6, 9, 12, then 15, 21, 27, and ending with 33. So I needed to go from 6 to 28. On my x-axis, it's the same labeling, the beginning of each class, and with the ending of the last class is your last tick mark. Okay. So for my first class, I have a relative frequency of 13%. So I'll go a height of 13 on the y-axis, beginning at 64 on the x-axis, and ending at the 75, the ending of the class interval. So let's move on to the second class. It has a relative frequency of 19%. So up to 19. And connecting, remember, no gaps in between the bars. Up to 28 for my third class. My fourth class has a relative frequency of 21, so I go height of 21. My next to last class has a relative frequency of 14, so a height of 14. And then the last class, relative frequency of 6%, so I do a height of 6. And then I shade in my bars. And then last but not least, I need to make sure I label my relative frequency on the top of each bars, just so that if I made a mistake on drawing the height, we know what it looks like. And that's how you draw histograms.